The crystalline towers of the Shalvari capital shimmered like frozen starlight, each spire catching the glow of the twin suns and scattering it into 1,000 colors. To Lieutenant Marcus Hale, it looked less like a city and more like someone had taken a dream and sculpted it out of glass. He wasn't supposed to be here as anything more than a quiet observer. His orders had been clear. Watch, report, and above all, don't cause trouble. Trouble, however, seemed to follow Marcus like a shadow. The Terran delegation had come as guests to the Shalvari court for the annual Festival of Ascension, a celebration where the royal family renewed their vows of stewardship over their people. For humanity, it was an opportunity. They were still newcomers to the galactic stage, viewed with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Deathworlders, the galaxy called them. Dangerous, unpredictable, but worth watching. And now Earth was trying to prove it could be a partner, not just a threat. The banquet hall was like nothing Marcus had ever seen. Vast crystal arches soared overhead, refracting light into rainbows that shifted with every breath of wind. Hundreds of alien dignitaries filled the chamber, their forms draped in silks, scales, or metallic exosuits. The air smelled faintly of flowers and ozone. At the head of it all, seated in a high, shimmering throne, was Princess Aylara, first, heir to the Shalvari Empire. She was striking in a way Marcus found hard to put into words. Her features were refined, her crystalline eyes reflecting starlight, and her presence carried a regal weight that hushed even the boldest courtiers. Yet there was something else about her, too, something that wasn't just majesty. Curiosity. Interest. A spark that made her lean forward when Marcus spoke, even when others dismissed humanity as rough barbarians. By some twist of fate, or perhaps the Shalvari's sly sense of humor, Marcus was seated beside her during the feast. He'd never been this close to royalty in his life. Back on Earth, he was the sort of man who got thrown out of bars for mouthing off, not someone who shared wine with an alien princess. At first, he tried to keep his mouth shut, content to nod, politely as dignitaries spoke of trade routes and ceremonial traditions. But Princess Aylara asked him questions directly, her voice smooth and lilting. "Tell me, Lieutenant Hale, is it true that Terrans mate for life?" Marcus blinked. A dozen nearby nobles leaned closer to hear his answer. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, much less on topics like this. "Well," he said slowly, "a lot of us try. Doesn't always work out, but yeah. The idea is you stick with one person through thick and thin." Aylara tilted her head, fascinated. "Strange. Among my people, partnerships are often fluid, shifting with cycles. Why do humans choose permanence?" Marcus shrugged, suddenly aware of how warm the room felt. "I guess because we're stubborn. And maybe because we want to believe that even in a universe this big, there's one person who's worth it." A murmur rippled through the courtiers. Some smirked, some scoffed, but the princess's crystalline eyes gleamed with interest. "And what of me?" she asked, a mischievous note in her tone. "Do you think I would make such a partner?" Marcus should have stopped there. He should have smiled politely, said something diplomatic, and steered the conversation back to safer ground. But he'd had just enough of the Shalvari's sweet, potent wine to loosen his tongue. And besides, she was looking at him with that spark of curiosity again, and he couldn't resist. "You'd make a good wife," he said with a lopsided grin. The words hung in the air like a dropped blade. Silence fell across the hall. The hum of conversation died. Even the musicians faltered mid-note. Princess Aylara's expression didn't change at first. She studied him with those crystalline eyes, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, slowly, she inclined her head. "I accept," she said clearly, her voice ringing like crystal bells through the hushed chamber. Marcus nearly spat out his wine. His heart slammed against his ribs. Around them, dignitaries gasped, some with horror, others with glee. He glanced at the Terran ambassador, who looked as though he were about to faint. The next morning, the Terran delegation awoke to a crisis, unlike any they had ever imagined. News of Lieutenant Marcus Hale's proposal had spread through the palace like fire in dry grass. By dawn, it wasn't just whispered in the corridors. It was the only topic across the entire capital. Among the Shalvari, words were not mere sounds. They carried force, weight, and permanence. To declare someone fit for bonding in front of witnesses was not seen as flattery or jest. It was an invocation of truth. And when Princess Ilara, heir to the throne, had said, "I accept," the contract had been sealed in the eyes of her people. The Terran ambassador, Jonathan Miles, looked like a man teetering on the edge of collapse. He stormed into Marcus's temporary quarters, his face pale. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even—" "No, of course you don't. You've just proposed to the princess of the Shalvari Empire in front of half the noble houses." Marcus rubbed his face with his hands, still groggy. "I didn't propose. I was joking. It was banter." "Banter?" Miles's voice cracked. "Here, banter is law. For them, you might as well have signed a marriage treaty in blood." As if to confirm the gravity of the situation, a procession of Shalvari courtiers arrived outside his quarters, bowing with unnerving solemnity. They weren't here to scold or punish. They were here to prepare him. Preparations for the trials, the ceremonies, the binding rituals. They spoke as if his marriage to the princess were already a certainty, as though the details simply needed arranging. Marcus's protests fell on deaf ears. To the Shalvari, there was no just kidding. Words once spoken were truth revealed. The princess herself visited him that afternoon, her presence calm and collected. She entered his chamber without guards, her silken robes catching the shifting light, and looked at him as though nothing at all were amiss. "You are troubled," she said. Marcus almost laughed in disbelief. "Troubled? Princess, I just accidentally proposed to you in front of a few hundred witnesses. My career is over. Earth's mission here is going up in flames, and half your court wants me dead." Her crystalline eyes studied him with that same disarming curiosity she had shown at the banquet. "Why should your words trouble you? Were they not true?" "They weren't supposed to mean anything." Marcus groaned, pacing the room. "On Earth, we joke about things like that. It's just a figure of speech. I didn't think—" "That is your error," Ilara interrupted gently. "Among my people, words shape reality. To say a thing aloud is to make it real. That is why we are careful with speech." She tilted her head. "Perhaps humanity is reckless not only in war but in words as well." Marcus slumped against the wall, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Princess, I'm not saying you wouldn't make a good— well, you know. I'm just saying I didn't mean it. You don't actually want this, do you?" But instead of anger or offense, Ilara's expression softened. "You fascinate me, Marcus Hale. Your kind is raw and untamed, yet stubbornly resilient. Most would have bowed, apologized, begged forgiveness. But you argue. You resist. That is why your words cannot be dismissed. They came from a place of truth, whether you recognize it or not." Her words silenced him more effectively than any reprimand could. He stared at her, at the calm certainty in her crystalline gaze, and for a fleeting moment wondered if perhaps she was right. Had some part of him meant it? Outside their private meetings, the palace was descending into chaos. Some factions of the court saw the potential union as a brilliant stroke of fortune, a political bond with humanity, the rising Deathworlders whose fleets were already making the old powers nervous. Others saw it as a humiliation, a betrayal of tradition, and an insult to Shalvari purity. Rumors filled the streets. Some whispered of assassins being hired to remove the human before the union could take root. Others murmured of Shalvari nobles sending secret envoys to Earth demanding Marcus be recalled or executed for his audacity. Back in his quarters, Marcus began to see that this wasn't just about him anymore. His slip of the tongue had cracked, open a divide in the empire itself. And standing in the middle of it all was Princess Ilara, calm as ever, treating his proposal not as an accident, but as destiny. Words as truth, and the court demanded proof. If a human dared claim the princess was suited to be his wife, then he would have to prove himself worthy. The tradition was ancient, the trials of union. For centuries, any outsider seeking to bond with the royal bloodline had been tested. Few survived, fewer still passed. The trials weren't designed for fairness. They were designed to expose weakness, to show whether a suitor was made of steel or sand. Marcus stood in the center of the crystalline arena as thousands of Shalvari nobles filled the stands. The sky above glowed with shifting auroras, natural phenomenon harnessed for spectacle. Every eye was on him, every whisper buzzing with contempt or curiosity. To them, he was a death-worlder savage, a barbarian whose words had ensnared their air. Princess Ilara sat in a high dais, her posture regal, her crystalline eyes fixed on him. When their gazes met, she inclined her head ever so slightly. It wasn't encouragement so much as expectation, Marcus muttered under his breath. This is insane. He wasn't a soldier bred for glory. Sure, he was fit, trained, and stubborn enough to get through most things, but this was theater, a test he hadn't signed up for. The first trial began with no warning. From hidden gates in the arena floor, beasts emerged. Hulking reptilian predators with armor-like hides and jaws wide enough to crush steel. They circled him, hissing, claws scraping against crystal. The crowd roared with approval. Marcus didn't have the elegant weapons of the Shalvari. He had been given a ceremonial blade, little more than a decorative piece. But if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was improvisation. He fought dirty, dodging, grabbing shards of broken crystal from the ground, jamming them into soft underbellies, using leverage and grit instead of finesse. By the time the beasts lay still, Marcus was bleeding from half a dozen cuts, his arm trembling with exhaustion. But he was alive. The second trial tested wit. Shalvari scholars approached him with riddles and logic puzzles designed to confound even their brightest. The nobles smirked, expecting the primitive to falter. Instead, Marcus leaned on a different kind of intelligence, not the elegance of theory, but the practicality of survival. When asked how to divide resources among 3 tribes with conflicting demands, he didn't try to craft a perfect equation. He told them what any Terran negotiator would. Make sure each tribe thinks they got the better deal. People don't need fairness. They need to believe they won. The crowd muttered at his audacity, but the judges nodded grimly. The third trial was the most brutal. A poison mist was released into the arena, a concoction that crippled lungs and clouded thought. Shalvari physiology struggled against it, and most outsiders would collapse within minutes. Marcus staggered, coughed, and nearly fell, but he kept moving. Humanity had evolved on a death world thick with toxins, predators, and diseases. His body fought with stubborn resilience, every cell screaming but refusing to yield. By the end of the trials, Marcus was battered, bloodied, and barely standing. The crowd, which had jeered him at the start, now murmured in uneasy tones. He had not triumphed with elegance or superiority. He had survived, and survival itself was a kind of victory. Princess Ilara descended from her dais, stepping onto the arena floor. The crowd hushed instantly. She walked toward Marcus, her gown trailing across shattered crystal, her expression unreadable. "You are bruised," she said softly, stopping before him. "I'm a mess," Marcus corrected, coughing hard. "And yet you did not yield." Her eyes glimmered, reflecting him like facets of a gem. "That is what I sought, not perfection, not power, but a partner who will stand when all others fall." Marcus blinked, uncertain how to respond. He wanted to laugh, to protest that this was all a misunderstanding, but something in her words rooted him in place. In her eyes, he saw not mockery or politics, but sincerity. She truly believed he had proven himself, not because of strength, but because he had refused to break. The nobles watched in silence as Ilara extended her hand. Marcus hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her grip was cool, firm, steady, and just like that, what had begun as a careless joke was transforming into something neither of them could easily dismiss. The Shalvari court had expected Marcus. Hail to die during the trials of union. That was the unspoken truth. The nobles who hated him thought the trials would rid them of this death-worlder accident, and even the sympathetic ones assumed his survival was impossible. Instead, Marcus had staggered out bloodied but unbeaten. To the Shalvari, that kind of resilience carried weight, even if they refused to admit it aloud. But his survival sent ripples beyond the capital. Across the stars, the Corran Syndicate watched closely. The Syndicate was a sprawling network of raiders, smugglers, and mercenaries who thrived in the cracks of the galactic order. They had long preyed on the Shalvari Empire's trade routes, striking from hidden bases and slipping away before Imperial fleets could respond. The rise of humanity already troubled them. Deathworlders with iron navies and stubborn tenacity, but now rumors spread of an alliance sealed by royal blood. A human bonded to the Shalvari heir? If true, it would shift the balance of power. An empire known for elegance and wealth combined with humanity's raw, unbreakable resolve. The Syndicate would lose its dominance. They decided to act before that could happen. The attack came on the night Marcus completed the trials. The palace still buzzed with the aftermath, some nobles whispering in grudging respect, others conspiring in fury. Marcus himself lay in his quarters, nursing bruises, and wondering how the hell his life had turned into a political nightmare. He half expected to wake up back on Earth with someone laughing at the absurd dream. Instead, he woke to the sound of explosions. The crystalline. Walls shook as blasts rocked the palace. Shards rained from the ceilings. Shouts echoed in alien tongues, and the air filled with the acrid sting of smoke. Marcus staggered to his feet, instincts kicking in. Through the shattered window, he saw dark shapes descending, Syndicate gunships, sleek and jagged like knives against the aurora-lit sky. The palace guards scrambled to respond, but the attackers had come prepared. Syndicate assassins in adaptive armor cut through the defenders with ruthless efficiency. Their weapons weren't ceremonial. They were built for slaughter. Marcus grabbed the first thing he could, a shard of broken crystal, jagged and sharp. He burst into the corridor just in time to see 3 assassins advancing toward Princess Ilara's chamber. "Not happening," he growled. He hit them like a boulder rolling downhill. The first assassin never saw it coming. Marcus slammed the crystal shard into the gap between plates, twisting until the man collapsed. The second tried to bring up his blaster, but Marcus ripped it from his hands and used it to fire point blank. The third managed to slash Marcus's arm, but Marcus, bleeding and furious, drove a fist into the assassin's throat until the armor dented. By the time the corridor fell silent, Marcus was panting, half covered in blood. Some his, some theirs. And then he heard her voice. "Marcus." Princess Ilara stepped from her chamber, clad in ceremonial armor, a long blade of iridescent crystal in her hands. Her expression was calm, though her eyes burned with something fierce. "They are here for me," she said. "But they will not succeed." Marcus met her gaze, chest heaving. Then let's make sure of it. The next hour was chaos. Syndicate fighters flooded the palace, cutting down guards and servants alike. But wherever they pressed hardest, Marcus and Lara were there. She fought with precision, every strike of her blade a perfect arc of deadly grace. He fought with brutality, improvised weapons, fists, sheer stubborn force. Where she disarmed, he broke. Where she cut, he smashed. Together, they became something, more than either alone. In the Great Hall, the pair fought back to back as syndicate mercenaries swarmed them. Ilara's crystal blade gleamed under torchlight, carving through armor, while Marcus used a shattered flagpole as a staff, bashing skulls and breaking limbs. The nobles who had sneered at him during the trials watched in stunned silence from balconies. The image burned into their minds, the princess of the Shalvari, fighting not with a fellow noble or decorated knight, but with the very human they had dismissed as unworthy. By dawn, the syndicate attack faltered. Reinforcements from the city finally pushed into the palace, driving the raiders back into their ships. The attackers retreated, leaving behind fire-scorched halls and too many dead. But they had failed. The princess still lived. Marcus collapsed. Onto the steps of the throne, his chest heaving, his arms bruised and raw. Ilara lowered herself beside him, her blade streaked with alien blood. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the groans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. Finally, Marcus said, half laughing, half exhausted, "You fight. Better than anyone I've ever seen." Her crystalline eyes softened as she looked at him. "And you fight like no one I've ever known. Reckless, wild, unbreakable." The palace still bore the scars of the syndicate's attack. Entire wings had collapsed where explosions shattered crystalline walls. Blackened scorch marks streaked the once pristine halls, and the air still carried the metallic tang of blood and smoke. Yet, amidst ruin, something new had taken root. Resolve. Word of the battle spread faster than any official declaration could. Across the Shalvari Empire, and soon across the wider galaxy, reports painted the same picture. The alien raiders had been repelled not just by Imperial guards, but by the princess herself and the human who fought at her side. The image was powerful. Regal grace joined with death-world ferocity. A partnership forged in survival. For Marcus Hale, the aftermath was surreal. One moment, he had been a cultural attaché terrified of ruining humanity's first diplomatic mission. Now, he was being treated not as an intruder, but as something dangerously close to a legend. Guards saluted him with hesitant respect. Nobles who had sneered at him days earlier now whispered his name with caution. He had gone from mistake to symbol in less than a week. The Terran ambassador, Jonathan Miles, wore the haunted look of a man who had aged 10 years overnight. "Do you understand what's happening, Hale? Earth can't just back out now. Too much is at stake." Marcus rubbed his temples. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't mean it to happen." "Intent doesn't matter anymore," Miles said grimly. "The galaxy saw you fight beside her. They saw you bleed for her. They saw her choose you. If Earth refuses this, we'll look like cowards. If you back out, we'll look like liars, as us." If the situation weren't complicated enough, the Shalvari court itself was now split down the middle. One faction fumed that their heir was tainted by a barbarian outsider. Another hailed the Union as destiny, a way to ensure survival in a galaxy teetering on the edge of new conflicts. In the middle of it all stood Princess Ilara, serene, unyielding, certain. To her, there was no division. When she looked at Marcus, she did not see scandal or politics. She saw a man who had spoken carelessly, but fought with sincerity, who had endured her people's trials, and stood at her side against death itself. The official proposal ceremony was arranged within days. Nobles from across the empire gathered. In the Grand Hall of Light, a vast chamber whose ceilings vanished into refracted stars. Terran officials arrived too, their faces tense but their suits immaculate. The weight of the galaxy seemed to rest on the event. Marcus stood at the center, his uniform freshly pressed but still bearing faint stains from the Syndicate battle, a reminder that he was no polished noble, no carefully groomed suitor. He was human. And that, for better or worse, was exactly what the Shalvari were getting. As the princess approached, draped in ceremonial robes that shimmered like flowing crystal, the hall fell silent. She stopped before him, her eyes reflecting his uncertain face. "Marcus Hale of Terra," she said, her voice carrying like chimes in a still night. "You spoke words that bound us. You fought when death sought me. You endured where others would have fallen. Will you now stand with me not as trial or accident, but as choice?" Marcus swallowed hard. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, how a joke had turned into this, but when he looked at her, he didn't see a trap. He saw a woman who had stood in fire and blood with him, who had never flinched, never doubted. A partner. He straightened. "I didn't mean it when I said it," he admitted, his voice carrying across the chamber. Gasps rippled through the nobles. The ambassador nearly fainted. But Marcus pressed on. "But I mean it now. Yes, I'll stand with you." Ilara's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Then so it shall be." When their hands clasped, the hall erupted, not with polite applause, but with the sound of history shifting. For the first time, humanity was not just a rising power on the edges of galactic politics. They were woven into the heart of an empire. Across the galaxy, allies and enemies alike took notice. The Syndicate fumed, realizing their failed strike had created something stronger than they had tried to prevent. Old powers, once dismissive of humanity, now recalculated. The Deathworlders were no longer wild outsiders. They had a seat at the table, secured by blood and marriage. Later that night, after the ceremonies, Marcus found himself alone with Ilara in the quiet gardens beyond the palace. Lanterns flickered among crystalline trees, casting light across her face. "You know this changes everything," he said softly. "Yes," she replied, "for both our peoples." He exhaled, shaking his head. "All because I couldn't keep my mouth shut." She laughed lightly, a sound like glass bells. "Or because perhaps you spoke a truth you did not yet recognize."